Graphic courtesy Senator Dan Sullivan. China and Russia are outmaneuvering the U.S., using aggressive actions that fall short of war, a group of generals and admirals have concluded. To counter them, the U.S. needs new ways to use its military without shooting, concludes a newly released report on the Quantico conclave. The U.S. military will need new legal authorities and new concepts of operation for all domains: land, sea, air, space, and cyberspace. From little green men in Crimea to fortified artificial islands in the South China Sea, from online meddling with U.S. elections to global information operations and to industrial-scale cyber-espionage, America's adversaries have found ways to achieve their objectives and undermine the West without triggering a U.S. military response, operating in what's come to be called the gray zone. No less a figure than Defense Secretary Jim Mattis took on the topic in his National Defense Strategy and in this morning's graduation address to the Naval Academy. General Joseph Dunford, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Defense Secretary Jim Mattis testified before Congress. Putin seeks to shatter NATO. He aims to diminish the appeal of the Western democratic model and attempts to undermine America's moral authority, ran Mattis's prepared text. The actions are designed not to challenge our arms, emphasis added, but to undercut and compromise our belief in our ideals. Likewise, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Gen. Joseph Dunford, has publicly warned that our adversaries don't abide by our doctrine, with its clear distinction between war and peace and its tidy phases of escalation. The American military operates in phases, with Phase 0 being peace, officially, shaping the environment, and so on. Traditionally, actions other than war are just that to the U.S. and do not merit a military response, let alone a kinetic one. What adversaries are doing is competition with a military dimension short of a Phase 3 or traditional conflict, he said as far back as 2016. Their employment of cyber, unconventional capability, space capabilities, and information operations go beyond what we would call Phase 0 shaping. From SECDEF and chairman, down to the units in the field, there's great recognition of the gray zone problem, said Nate Frere, a researcher at the Army War College. Frere wasn't involved with the Quantico conference or writing the report, but I consulted him as a leading expert on the concept. Awareness has grown dramatically since just 2 years ago, Frere said, when he and his colleagues published a study on the gray zone called Outplayed and Dunford was making his comments on competition. I do think that the U.S. military recognizes that dilemma, but I'm not sure they know how to respond to it yet, Frere told me. This idea that states like China and Russia are engaged in a persistent campaign to undermine U.S. and allied interests over time, employing methods that fall well short of conventional military conflict, at the national level, we're still coming to grips with that. A Russian Su-24 buzzes the USS Cook in the Baltic Sea, April 12, 2016. Peer adversaries, competitors, don't want competitive activities to progress to war because they know the capability of U.S. forces in open conflict. Why would they go there when they are achieving strategic objectives by remaining in competition short of armed conflict? I covered the Quantico conference, but, like most attendees, I wasn't allowed in the special seminar reserved for generals and admirals. The event focused on the effort to coordinate forces across the land, sea, air, space, and cyberspace in a single seamless campaign known as multi-domain operations. But the senior officers concluded that battle was too narrow a term, too focused on the tactical level of war during conflict alone, in the words of the report. The concept should be renamed multi-domain operations to better capture, throughout the competition continuum. From deterring adversaries during competition, quickly defeating adversaries in a short and decisive action to return to competition, or defeating adversaries in the event of a protracted conflict, short and decisive won't apply in conflict against a great power, one briefer emphasized during the conference. The cycle described here, competition either deters or escalates to conflict, conflict resolves and de-escalates to competition, derives from Mattis's National Defense Strategy, which emphasizes the re-emergence of long-term strategic competition. Arguably, the word competition better captures what's happening between the U.S. and China, or the U.S. and Russia, than the terms like peace, or strategic shaping, aka Phase 0. To the extent that saying competition helps people understand Russia and China are rivals, engaged in deliberate malign activities. Frere told me the term is helpful. But it's not helpful, he went on, if conflict and competition just become a new pair of rigid categories to replace war and peace, obscuring the messiness of the real world. The report from Quantico keeps falling into this intellectual trap. Consider this passage. Just as the binary war-peace paradigm is insufficient to describe the global operating environment, authorities that are only available during conflict are insufficient. The joint force needs certain authorities prior to conflict in order to set the conditions to dominate if hostilities commence. Yes, the first words of this passage acknowledge that war and peace are not a clear-cut either-or, but the rest of it talks about during conflict and prior to conflict, as if these are clearly distinct phases. We're stuck, Frere told me. We are still institutionally and culturally stuck in this five-phase model of operations. Our adversaries certainly aren't. Official phase model of military operations. Source: Joint Publication JP 30, Joint Operations. Frere's strategy. The U.S. military should recognize that we can't operate in this peace-war dichotomy effectively anymore. Frere said, "We are actually in a persistent competition. That competition sometimes becomes more heated. It is sometimes becomes closer to cooperation, rather than distinct phases," he said. "It's a sine wave. As tensions go up and down, you always have two goals in mind. You're trying to impose costs on the opponent and, at the same time, offer off-ramps to the opponent for de-escalation," Frere said. "That's actually a pretty sophisticated approach. Every ship that sails, every advisor that goes abroad to train allies, every unit that participates in exercises, needs to be part of a larger plan to demonstrate U.S. resolve and capability," Frere said. "The ultimate goal isn't just to respond to what the Chinese and Russians are doing in the gray zone," he told me. "It's to force them to respond to what we are doing in the gray." Nate Frere, for example, the U.S. Navy already conducts freedom of navigation operations (FONOPS) to defy unwarranted maritime claims around the world. But we do them with an even-handedness that's almost comically scrupulous, challenging everything from China's island building in the South China Sea to Malta's excessive strait baselines in the Mediterranean. Instead, Frere says, freedom of navigation operations should occur in a way that demonstrates military capability. It's not just a case of sailing someplace to prove you can, he argues, it's demonstrating you could conduct a military operation there if you needed to. On land, Frere said, special operations forces originated during World War II as a way to assist or create resistance movements in Axis-occupied territory. During the Cold War, NATO Special Ops laid the groundwork for partisan activity in West Germany in case of a Soviet invasion. If we rebuilt these unconventional warfare capabilities, we could make aggressors think twice about invading territory primed for resistance. We could even demonstrate to Russia and China we could assist resistance movements inside their territory, a threat both countries would take seriously given their long struggles with ethnic separatists. Actually conducting unconventional warfare on Russian or Chinese territory would escalate right out of the gray zone and into an active war, Frere notes. He's just saying we should prove to them we could. Likewise, he doesn't think the U.S. should conduct Russian-style assassinations on foreign soil or engage in fake news propaganda. "There are some places we are probably not willing to go," he told me, and that's a good thing. Within those moral limits, however, there's still a lot of innovative things we can think of, especially in cyberspace, Frere said, as long as we let ourselves. We have to spend some intellectual capital right now in defining what presence, maneuver, and action look like in those spaces, short of open military conflict, he told me. The United States has to become less rigid in its view of military operations.